The arty flavour of the Welch household resembles that of the Bardwells too. Amos described the Whitsun weekend he spent there in 1949 to Larkin. "We had a nice Whitsun, I hope you did. Wasn't the weather marvellous? We went over to the missus's people over at Harwell. Proper scream the old boy Ossosod is, with his folk dancing. And old Bill, Bardwell, Hilly's brother, a composer, with his concertos and symphonies. Little Marian Partington, Hilly's niece, was there too. I had all the usual kicks, an account of a blind fiddler, over 80 he is, at Adderbury. A meritless short story shown to me by Mummy B. A talentless and flavourless sonatina played me gratuitously by William. Bill B has given himself the shits by his own filthy French cooking, that'll teach him. With his I'm more at home in France than in England balls. Yes, you stabrad. Bastard. You are a star dab." Only one incident in Lucky Jim was taken from an event that actually occurred. When the Duke of Edinburgh visited the college at Swansea, a reception was held, at which drinks were handed round. The registrar, Edwin Drew, took care to see that this unusual service was cut off after only a round or two, certainly before Amos had had his fill. The same thing happens at the reception before Jim Dixon gives his disastrous lecture on Merry England. Amos also borrowed some words from Dylan Thomas, whom he met one evening in 1951 in a pub. After a glass or two of light ale, Thomas announced, "I've just come back from Persia, where I've been pouring water on troubled oil." There had recently been a crisis over Iranian threats to nationalize British oil interests. Amos made his stock retort to the prepared epigram. I said, "I must go and write that down." Eventually Amos did exactly that, putting some of the same words into the mouth of the odious Bertrand, son of Professor Welch, who says that the government's foreign policy might have been a good deal worse, with the exception of their spectacular inability to pour water on troubled oil. When Jim Dixon had to be provided with a subject for an academic paper he is writing, in the hope that one L.S. Caton will find room for it in a shadowy new journal he is said to be publishing, Amos asked his friend Esmond Cleary, an economics lecturer at Swansea, if he could think of a suitably dim and dreary topic. Cleary came up with "The Economic Influence of the Developments in Shipbuilding Techniques 1450 to 1485. A perfect title, Jim thought, for the way it crystallized the article's niggling mindlessness, its funereal parade of yawn-enforcing facts, the pseudo-light it threw upon non-problems. These, then, were some of the ways in which Amos accumulated some of the details of his novel. Happening on a scene that sparked his imagination, the Leicester Senior Common Room, borrowing aspects of character and appearance from real people, Daddy B, Monica Jones, incorporating small incidents and places from life, the cutting off of drinks at a reception, the cemetery near the college, helping himself to names, Dixon, Mitchie, making in-jokes for the amusement of friends, Professor Welch and his folk dancing. But none of these were incorporated into the novel for the sake of any kind of autobiographical realism. Amos's intention was to write a good, readable, funny story, and all his material had to be bent to that purpose. So, for example, Larkin simply disappeared from the novel, because he is not the character Jim Dixon needs if he is to play the part assigned him by the plot. The cemetery across the road from Jim's college is inserted not for any reasons of geographical authenticity, but to be the basis for a joke about the honours class over the road. And if Professor Welch was based on Daddy B, the likeness was not so close that Daddy B ever recognized himself in the professor, although perhaps transforming Daddy B into Welch had exorcising effects on Amos. At any rate, he never did stick a knife into his father-in-law. But there is another matter of realism, or otherwise. How far does Lucky Jim represent Amos himself? All my heroes, Amos has written, start from me, and in a sense, stay with me. As always, in an Amos novel, though, the signals are confusing, often deliberately so. The most obvious resemblance between Jim and Amos is that both lecture at a provincial university college, but Amos had thought of this job for his hero long before he became a lecturer himself, and he gave Jim other characteristics that were not his own. Jim lectures in history, Amos in English. Jim comes from Lancashire, Amos from London. Jim is single, Amos married. Jim hates Mozart, whom Amos adores. Jim appears drunk at a public lecture, which Amos is far too law-abiding, and, as he himself put it, cowardly ever to do. Old school and Oxford friends of Amos had another reason for thinking they recognized him in Jim. Jim's talent for pulling faces matches Amos's. Indeed, the two share much the same repertoire, including a Chinese mandarin face, a crazy peasant face, Martian invader, lemon-sucking, Eskimo, Edith Sitwell, Evelyn Waugh, Lascar, Mandrill, even a sex life in ancient Rome face. But Amos and Jim pulled the same faces for different reasons. Amos's faces were for entertaining his friends. Dixon's are done mostly behind people's backs, and act as the covert protests and tension reducers of a man in enemy territory without effective allies. There were, then, enough similarities between Amos and Jim for friends to think they recognized the author in his hero, as did others who knew no more about Amos than the bare outline of his biography. It was an easy step from there to investing Amos with some of Jim's other, less pleasant qualities, especially his aggressively Philistine attitudes. Dixon's policy is to read as little as possible of any given book. He tells Margaret, "You know as well as I do that I can't sing, I can't act, I can hardly read, and thank God I can't read music. Haven't you noticed," Dixon asks his friend Beasley, "how we all specialize in what we hate most?" Meaning, in his own case, medieval history. Most notoriously, Dixon talks of filthy Mozart. It was talk like this that upset Somerset Maugham, and led him to include Dixon in a new class, the white-collar proletariat, which he labelled scum. Maugham took care not to attach the label to Amos, but by a familiar process of osmosis others did, turning him, by association, into someone held to believe in the filthiness of Mozart too. This is the opposite of the truth. Amos loves music, considers it first among the arts, and believes Mozart preeminent among composers. In July 1951, Amos wrote to Larkin that he had just bought 3 more Mozart piano concertos, and some other long-haired stuff, which would all be a bit beyond you, I fear. He called Mozart divine, and urged Larkin to go into a gramophone shop and play yourself the first side of the D minor piano concerto, or the slow movement of the C major one, K467, and see if you can go on thinking what you do, you fool. It is not even clear that Jim Dixon himself dislikes Mozart. What he certainly does dislike is hearing a snatch of Mozart's music sung badly by Professor Welch, first thing in the morning, when he is a guest of Welch's, has destroyed his host's bedclothes by falling asleep while smoking, and has the most devastating hangover. Immediately after thinking of filthy Mozart, Dixon, very slowly, like a forest giant under the axe, heeled over sideways and came to rest with his hot face on the pillow. At a moment of supreme crisis like this, almost anybody might think Mozart filthy. Where Amos is present in the novel, it is often in ways least likely to be recognized by his readers. He is there in Dixon, who struggles to keep inside his smoking ration, and wonders how he is going to make £3 last the 9 days until payday. He is in the Dixon who worries about the awful business of getting on with women. He is very much in the Dixon who regards himself as a boredom detector, a finely tuned instrument, who could be sent ahead like a canary down a mine, so that the boredom coefficient of any gathering could be read off him. And insofar as Dixon's dislike of anything that could be called culture is really a dislike of pretension and exclusiveness, of culture as the possession of horrible snobbish people like Professor Welch and his hateful sons, then Amos is with him there too. In spite of his own firm belief that what he had written was pure fiction, Amos did have some qualms about the possibility that people might see things in his novel which weren't there, might even see themselves. When Lucky Jim was being prepared for publication by Gollancz, he wrote to his publisher Hilary Rubinstein, Victor Gollantz's nephew, "I don't know whether your firm makes a practice of putting in the all characters are fictitious formula at the front of their books. If so, it might make my life smoother if something were appended to it in my case along the lines of, in particular, the University College depicted, together with its members, must be clearly understood as having no connection whatever with any such institution in real life." Amos wanted this just for the sake of common room comfort. It wasn't that he thought he had produced recognizable portraits of his colleagues, but that they might mistakenly think they recognized themselves. The trouble was, as he put it in another letter to Rubinstein, soon afterwards, "Some of the men may hate me here for ridiculing aspects of college life in general, but," this was the important distinction, "I'm confident there's nothing libelous, that is, nothing derogatory of any specific individual." To make his point that Gollancz need have no fear of being bombarded with writs, Amos set out the few passages where the novel connected with reality. The college described in the book has a couple of points in its physical setup in common with Leicester, to lead people away from Swansea, e.g. the cemetery opposite, but nothing else in common with either college. Everything is quite unlike Swansea, town as well as college. As regards the characters mentioned, Professor Welch is based slightly on my father-in-law, between ourselves, but on nobody in college here, and Evan Johns, in point of name and appearance only, resembles a lecturer in music I met once for about 5 minutes in Belfast. Bertrand Welch, Margaret Peel, and Carol Goldsmith are as fictitious as any fictional characters ever are, I should imagine. No incidents are based on anything that happened here, or anywhere else as far as I know. Apart from the cemetery mentioned, not a single place corresponds to reality. There is no such town and city, as far as I know. Professor Welch's house is all made up, so is the ballroom, the digs, etc. The stuff on page 173 or so about exam passing, which implied the results were rigged to look good, could be taken as referring to Swansea, I suppose, but equally to dozens of other provincial colleges, and I hardly think the Swansea Senate would condemn themselves by corporately prosecuting us. The ex-registrar at this place used to cut off the drink at sherry parties, but I imagine the same applies to that. That's really all I can think of. Amos was less than entirely candid about Margaret Peel, omitting to mention her resemblance to the real Monica Jones, presumably because there was no risk of her suing. But otherwise, the list appears complete. Amos would hardly have put his first novel at risk of destruction through libel cases by lying to his publisher about its contents. The rest of Lucky Jim is fiction. Amos made it all up. This has never stopped people believing that there must be some real character lurking behind every fictional one. If not Amos, then somebody else. At least once a year for the nearly 40 years that Amos's colleague, Sam Dawson, continued to lecture at Swansea after Lucky Jim was published, it would occur to one of his students that he might be the original of Jim Dixon, simply because both he and Jim come from the north of England. Such is the general inability to believe that novelists can and do actually invent their characters, something that has irritated Amos all his fiction-writing life. On the 3rd of March 1953, Amos wrote to Larkin that he had finally settled on a title. "I've called it Lucky Jim now, to emphasize the luck theme. Epigraph, 'Oh, Lucky Jim, how I envy him.' These 2 lines from an old song were to appear at the beginning of the book. I'm afraid you are very much the ideal reader of the thing, and chaps like you don't grow on trees. Of course not." On the 30th of March, Amos announced that the book was done. "Well, my old bandolero, I have just this moment finished my last task on that Dixon thing, so that it is all ready to send to a lot of men who don't know a good thing when they see one. And by way of celebration, I'm letting you hear the good news at once. It comes to 349 pages of quarto, which is about 87,000 words, which is a lot. Amos had just been through his typescript for the last time, changing things like Arod to Road, and his Indian beggar face to his Evelyn War face. The only thing he felt with any certainty about the finished draft is that it is the finished draft. No, or almost no, bugger is going to make me do anything to it ever again." It was entirely appropriate that Amos should let Larkin know he had finished Lucky Jim as soon as he had done so. Larkin had played the part of inner audience to the full. He had made a great many proposals, some of which Amos accepted, others not. It was Larkin who suggested that Margaret should have another admirer besides Jim Dixon. This became Catchpole, who was also able to clear up Dixon's suspicions about Margaret's supposed suicide attempt, which she had made in order to win the sympathy of both Catchpole and Jim. The discovery that she had not been serious about it, giving Jim the justification he needed for abandoning her for Christine. Larkin thought Professor Welch should go in for pottery and weaving, but Amos stuck to magical singing and recorder playing, rather to Larkin's annoyance. And Larkin had helped Amos get rid of some surplus characters and put greater emphasis on others. He thought Amos was too soft on Bertrand, Professor Welch's artist's son, and persuaded him to make Bertrand even more hateful. Less tangibly, Larkin's continuing interest and support had helped Amos to keep on working at his story when he might otherwise have run out of conviction and the steam to carry on. Larkin had earned his recognition as Lucky Jim's dedicatee. But in helping Amos get launched as a novelist, he had done something else. He had helped to secure Amos's independence as a writer. After this first novel, Amos never again needed so active an inner audience to guide him. Lucky Jim was the only novel he was to show in draft form to a third person and ask for advice. Lucky Jim's publication went as well as any first novel could hope. This time round, Amos had no difficulty finding a publisher willing to take his book on. Hilary Rubinstein, whom he had known slightly at Oxford, had gone on to work for the publishing firm of Victor Gollancz, his uncle. Rubinstein spotted a biographical note Amos had written about himself for a pen poetry anthology, in which he said he was in the middle of writing a novel. In November 1952, Rubinstein wrote to him saying, "If you are not committed elsewhere, would you care to send it to us when it is finished?" Amos replied that he would be very glad to do so. "It would never make an author's or a publisher's fortune," he said modestly, "but I think it is quite funny. That, at any rate, is its aim." He promised it for February or March the following year, but in the event posted it off on the 15th of April, 2 weeks after he had finished the typescript and the day before his 31st birthday, with a note which said, "As you'll see, serio-comedy is the formula, really. Though if it gets by at all, I imagine it'll get by chiefly on the score of the comic angle. Still, that's all up to you." The following day, before Rubinstein had had a chance to read the typescript, Amos sent him another letter with the news that a long passage from his novel was going to be read out on the BBC third programme. "Since I still believe, in the face of much contrary evidence, that acceptance by the BBC is a recommendation rather than the reverse, I pass on this information in the hope that someone at your end shares my belief." The radio broadcast was a stroke of luck. John Wayne had been given a series called First Reading, with instructions to liven things up by selecting young contributors. A previous series run by John Layman, the former editor of Penguin New Writing, had been judged dull for its dependence on an older generation of writers, which may perhaps have been unfair, there not yet being much sign of a new generation around. Wayne opened his series on the 26th of April with the extract from Lucky Jim, described as a novel in progress, which was taken from the incident in which Jim Dixon sets fire to his bed while a guest in Professor Welch's home. So the reading public was introduced to Amos's novel even before its acceptance for publication was confirmed. The day after the broadcast, Rubinstein gave Amos his verdict. "I think it is a really brilliant book, and got more fun out of it than anything else I've read for a long time." He had put off saying so, he wrote, until his own opinion had been confirmed by the firm's chief reader, J.R. Evans, and confirmation had come in only that morning. "I'm happy to say that he shares my great enthusiasm for the book. Now everybody in the firm is itching to read it." Amos wrote back by return that he was overjoyed by all the nice things Rubinstein had to say. Somehow the thought of anyone actually liking it came as a great surprise. Rubinstein was careful to insert a slender get-out clause in this first response, saying that he is 99.999% certain Gollancz would be making him an offer. In fact, there was some resistance inside the firm, from its chief, Victor Gollancz himself. He never took to Lucky Jim, thinking it vulgar and anti-cultural, and never really liked the other Amos books he published. His daughter Livia and Rubinstein persuaded him he was wrong about Lucky Jim, and when the novel sold well, Gollancz became an enthusiastic supporter of Amos's work, publishing everything he wanted in order to keep him, even poetry that did not look likely to be much of a seller. One minor point remained to be settled, the title. Rubinstein reported unhappiness with Lucky Jim for having a faintly novelette-ish sound to it. Amos made no objection to a change, and suggested his original title, Dixon and Christine, but that seemed not to have the right ring to it either, and nobody having a better idea, Lucky Jim it stayed, and a contract to publish it was agreed, including payment of £100. At the end of May 1953, Amos told Larkin that he felt a bit let down now that Lucky Jim's fate was settled. "In a way, it wants to make me want to stop writing, like a man who's satisfied with one seduction because he's proved he can do it and wanted reassurance, not pleasure." But he told Larkin not to take him too seriously. "No doubt I shall be fudging something up by the end of the summer, about a Welsh provincial university or something." When he got a proof of Lucky Jim a fortnight later, he told Larkin that he had read it through with mounting admiration. For the first time he felt he had written a book. But he also remembered and saw the point of a remark Larkin made long before about feeling embarrassed and only slightly interested at the idea of your first novel coming out. Amos got on quickly with the business of correcting his proofs, an efficient device for making you hate what you have written, as he described it to Larkin, and got momentary cold feet about the problems of recognition. "I'm terrified now of the probable local effect of the thing. I keep finding more and more bits that might be taken as referring to people here." Rubinstein sent a proof copy to C.P. Snow, the novelist who also reviewed for the Sunday Times, along with an effusive letter in which he aimed to whet Snow's interest by saying that Amos's novel had something in common with the work of Snow's friend, William Cooper, whom Amos did indeed admire. Both Cooper and Snow read the book and liked it enough to want to meet its author. Amos came up to London for a lunch at the beginning of July. Snow was not available, but he met Cooper, who gave Amos some well-intentioned and useful advice, as Amos told Larkin. "I know that's bound to sound frenziedly ironical, but it isn't meant to be." The encounter stirred Amos's enthusiasm to make writing another novel his first priority, and told Rubinstein he hoped to get it done by the beginning of the next year. Snow came through handsomely, providing a 2-sentence puff for the jacket, which Rubinstein thought would greatly help the book's chances of being reviewed. The puff said, "Lucky Jim is humorous, self-mocking, hopeful, and endearing. For promise and achievement combined, it is the best first novel I have read in the last 2 years." Further puffs were forthcoming from Cooper, Lehman, and J.D. Scott, the literary editor of The Spectator. Although Rubinstein had wanted to get the book out by Christmas 1953, Victor Gollancz decided otherwise, preferring to rely on a favoured tactic of his own. January would be better, he thought, especially for a new writer, since it was a quiet month in the publishing trade and Lucky Jim would stand a better chance of getting noticed when there was less competition for reviewers' column inches. The delay was annoying for Amos because under his contract his £100 advance was not due until publication date. In July he sent Rubinstein that embarrassing thing, a begging letter. He had been on a holiday trip, and the avarice of Oxford hotel keepers and publicans has reduced us temporarily to a state approaching beggary. Could Rubinstein let him have £25 advance on an advance? Rubinstein could, and promptly did. In November Amos wrote again, along the same lines, this time wondering how soon he might get his hands on some of the money from the American publisher Doubleday, to which Gollancz had by then sold rights in Lucky Jim for $2,500. The previous month Amos had written to Larkin, "Why don't Doubledays pay me the money they owe me, filthy, cheating dollar imperialists?" A few days later, on the 17th of October, Amos calculated that after drawing his first £10 from the bank and handing over £7 to Hilly, he would have £3, 15 shillings and sixpence left, or an average of 5 shillings 5.5 pence per diem. To Larkin he went on, "Pretend you're happy when you're blue, because there's fuck all." His letter to Rubinstein was more circumspect. "I don't know whether I'm more avaricious than most of your authors, but recently I found my mind turning more and more often to the question of money, the Doubleday kind in particular. I'm sorry to sound grasping, but there it is." Rubinstein told him that his money was not due until July, which was rather dismal news to Amos, who was worried now about the impending arrival of a third child in the family. He asked Rubinstein if he could let him have some of my dollar equivalent sent on to me as soon as convenient after the amount comes to you. About half the total, a good bit over £300, would just do us nicely. Equip the baby with nappies and buy me a couple of drinks and a shirt as well. Rubinstein agreed to get Amos his money as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Amos had another stroke of luck. John Wayne wanted to publish his poems in a new series being produced by his university, Reading. Amos had to get a selection together as quickly as possible, and on the 27th of July he wrote to Larkin for help. "Since I'm less confident of my ability to discriminate among my own work than some chaps, I wonder if you'd be good enough to glance through these." There were to be 24 pages of text in the book, with a maximum of 34 lines to a page. Larkin made his choice promptly, and Amos wrote to thank him on the 3rd of August. Of the 18 poems which were finally selected for the book, Larkin had approved 14 and queried 2, leaving only 2 he had evidently not thought much of. One of those went in because Wayne liked it, and the other because Amos did, though I've never met anyone else who does. Amos asked Larkin for help in choosing the title for his poetry book too. He agreed with Larkin that a title should be plain, but found it hard to think of one that was not pretentiously plain. Among those he suggested were A Temperate Zone, Thoughts on Paper, A Train of Thought, and One-Man Charades. In the end he settled for none of these, but found a new one. The book was published under the title A Frame of Mind. A bit dowdy, certainly, but plain without being pretentiously so, and descriptive of the contents to some extent. These poems are a way of looking at things, and the result of getting into a certain fairly definable mental attitude. While Amos fretted at the delay in publishing his first novel, he got started on his second, though he found progress on this held up by rehearsal for a college production of Hamlet, in which he had agreed to play Osric, as well as choose the music and put the records on. Since Ophelia dies before Osric appears, Amos was able to hand over this task to the female student who played her, Frances Climie, before he went on stage. The production in December got good write-ups, Amos told Larkin, though they did not mention him, except they were all shocked by my straight-as-a-die playing of a pansy. I did my homo laugh at least 4 times, but there was comfort in reports that a lot of the girls were saying I was marvellous and an absolute scream. In spite of its later start, A Frame of Mind beat Lucky Jim to publication. It's nice and warm in here now, Amos wrote to Larkin 8 days into 1954. The cat and dog lie couched at my feet. My wife reads H.E. Bates and eats a red apple. Near her is copy number 1 of A Frame of Mind. Sally, the Amos's third child, arrived before Lucky Jim too, on the 17th of January. The birth took place at home. When a pink fuzzy head began to appear, Amos went quickly downstairs and read a page of Lucky Jim with great attention. After 2 to 3 minutes, there was the sound of a baby crying. Hilly, Amos reported to Larkin, was very fit, apple-cheeked as ever, and very pleased with herself for producing a girl. So am I. Sally, Amos thought, looks no worse than might be expected. Rather better, really. Larkin responded by writing a poem for the new child, born yesterday, for Sally Amos, in which he wished her something nobody else would, that she might be dull, if that is what a skilled, vigilant, flexible, unemphasized, enthralled catching of happiness is called. The poem arrived very soon after Sally, and Amos replied on the 23rd. Sodding good and touching was the poem, moving me a great deal as poem and as friendship assertion. I think it's about the nicest thing anybody could do for any newborn child. 2 days later, Lucky Jim was at last published, in an edition of 750 copies, price 10 shillings and 6pence, and Amos celebrated by taking the swiftly recovered Hilly into Swansea for dinner and opening a bottle of champagne. Rubinstein had sent him the standard 6 free author's copies, and Amos wrote back to thank him. I'm absolutely delighted with the edition from every point of view. A most handsome job. Amos also announced that he had reached page 40 of his second novel, for which he already had a title, That Uncertain Feeling. This might seem to Rubinstein a step back rather than forward, since Amos had earlier told him he had written more than 100 pages, but it was retrogression in appearance only. This is the final draft, and as before is progressing swiftly. I thought I could do it in 1 draft, but it seems I am a 2-draft man, and must just accept the fact. Which Amos did. He remained a 2-draft man for the rest of his life, putting each of his novels through the same process of first and final versions. He was unwilling to give Rubinstein a firm date for his fair copy of That Uncertain Feeling, but aimed for March. There have been 1 or 2 distractions here recently, of which the arrival of a new Amos, female, at 2 a.m. today is perhaps the most important. Incipient fatherdom is a great inspiration in the long run, no doubt, but not in the short run. The fame that Jim has brought me is sending me giddy, Amos wrote to Rubinstein on the first day of February. I am to judge the oral English competition at the Eisteddfod at Llewellyn y Bryn Girls' School, Walter Road, Swansea, and there is to be a piece about me in the students' paper. They wanted to head it the Kingsley report, but I soon killed that. In the same letter, Amos acknowledged the receipt of 2 cheques from Gallant's in the previous fortnight, and the great feeling of bonhomie that swept through me as I took them out of the envelopes. 2 weeks later, he had yet more encouraging news to respond to. Lucky Jim was already in its 4th printing. My oath, I never expected this kind of thing. Just shows the great British public aren't such fools after all. Yet these rapid reprintings were not quite such impressive evidence of British taste as they sounded. It was Victor Gallant's cautious habit to print relatively few books at a time, particularly books by unknown writers. Then if the book didn't sell, he hadn't wasted too much money. But if it did sell, he could slap 2nd, 3rd, and 4th impression on every new order of 1,000 or 2 copies he made, thus giving the appearance that the book was going with even greater zip than it was. In fact, there were about 7,500 copies in print by mid-February. A week later, Lucky Jim went into its 5th impression. The momentum was continuing to build. An almost uniformly good press had helped it on its way. The Observer's Shauna Phelan was first off the mark on the 24th of January, saying Amis had made the gayest of bricks with the most common straw. In the next week's Spectator, John Metcalf said it was a very funny, very human novel. Anthony Powell in Punch declared the novel had energy and form and a real power of presenting the academic world it describes. Walter Allen in the New Statesman called Amis a novelist of formidable and uncomfortable talent. The anonymous reviewer in The Times called Dixon a genuinely comic, yet credible character, and in the Daily Telegraph John Betjeman compared the novel to a Harold Lloyd film or a Buster Keaton film in prose. Amis had sent a copy of the book to Betjeman, who told him in a letter that he had sat up until 3:30 in the morning reading it, and that he had certainly never read such a consistently enjoyable book. Amis got letters too. Fan mail, not too bad on the whole, he wrote to Larkin on the 19th of February. One from Geoffrey Gora, one from Tynan, one from that fucking mean ponce Roger Sharrock, asking me to send him a copy, one from a painter, one from a boy at school I wanted to bugger, too late now. None from cultural nymphs, unless you count Mummy B. Daddy B ran true to form. He wrote to Amis after reading the only two unfavourable reviews so far in the Sunday Times and the News Chronicle, and began with a lengthy paragraph about the correct pronunciation of the Welsh name Myfanwy, which had been given the infant Sally as her middle name. Amis did get a letter from a nymph a few days later, in fact from Elizabeth Simpson. She addressed him Dear Bill, and signed herself sincerely Betty Simpson, and she said, "May I congratulate you on the publication of your first novel? I think perhaps I may." Amis recognized the handwriting and told Larkin that it still had power to make me pant and tremble slightly. Funny, all that. Sometimes these cogitations still amaze. Oh, lyric love, half angel and half bum. By the middle of March, Amis reckoned he'd spent 14 shillings on stamps answering fan letters over the previous 25 days, a sum which would now buy postage for 3 letters, but in the mid-1950s would have sent 67 letters on their way, or 84 postcards. The fans included one ex-army acquaintance and a handful of Oxford craps, the rest painters, American agents, script editors, drama, sound, features producers, Wales, actors wanting to play Dixon on the films, sexual maniacs, male. Amis felt encouraged and discouraged too. "I feel in a sense that they can't stop me now," he told Larkin, "except when I take up my new novel and feel how easy it will be for me to stop myself." More success was on the way. On top of book sales came proposals from the BBC to broadcast a radio adaptation by the wonderfully named E.J. King Bull, while the Bolting brothers optioned the film rights for £200. In fact, there had been interest in film rights even before Lucky Jim was published, much to the amazement of Amis, who thought I'd seen to it that no one could visualize a single page of Jim on screen. For an exhilarating spell, it even looked as though Alfred Hitchcock would make the film, but he failed to take up his option. Foreign publishers began to take an interest in translation rights. "Looking forward to seeing you at the premiere of Lucky Jim on Ice," Amis ebulliently wrote to Rubinstein in April. The early news from America was less good. Doubleday had made a money-back offer. If readers didn't find Lucky Jim uproariously funny, their $3.50 would be returned. Copies came back in shoals. But Amis was too elated to let himself be depressed. "Rather a gloomy letter from Doubleday," he scribbled at the end of a letter to Rubinstein. "Good reviews, poor sales. What do I care, though, with 7/8 of $2,500 in the bag?" Amis thoroughly enjoyed his success. Now he could buy a television set and have drink in the house, the Larkin test of affluence, but let himself get rather carried away by it all, anticipating his earnings by spending them before the checks came in. On the 4th of April he wrote to Rubinstein saying that if you could let me have a cut of the option money fairly soon it would come in very handy. "We are being more or less compelled to buy a car, of all things, next week, and this will leave my bank account in rather a debilitated condition." 4 days later he wrote again asking Rubinstein to "hurry up that £180 like a good fellow, or I shall be reduced to smoking toilet paper. I bought the car yesterday, or rather paid the deposit. Mad, mad." In October he wrote again, "Hope is not dead in my bosom, it's my bank account that makes me sweat a little, and this is where I begin to feel embarrassed. Can any money be winkled out of your concern in the near future? I ask this in a hushed tone and inside a personal envelope. so that you can handle this just as you see fit. Handling, of course, includes instant destruction of the letter." Amos admitted that on the prospects of a film deal he had plunged into spending rather, and I'm now facing some unpleasant bills, plus a shocking income tax demand. Now, naturally, I blame no one but myself for this bit of prenatal chicken counting, but if you could manage to get together some cash for me, the more the better. You would save your old pal a heap of worry." Rubinstein quickly obliged with a cheque which Amos said would help tremendously towards keeping the Amos family afloat, until I get the £10,000 advance from you for my next novel. But Amos's second novel was not progressing as fast as expected. The typescript he had hoped to deliver in March was still a work in progress in October. By the end of this first year, Lucky Jim was in its 16th Gollancz-style impression, and had sold some 12,000 copies. Sales continued to swell in Britain, America, and elsewhere. By 1972 it had sold 1.25 million in its American paperback form alone. The book was eventually translated into 20 languages, under such French and Italian titles as Jim Le Chance and Jim il Fortunato, but also into more uncommon tongues like Czech, Hebrew, Korean, and Serbo-Croat. It was filmed by the Bolting brothers, and Jim was later turned into the central character in a television sitcom. In 1992 it was republished as a Penguin 20th Century classic. It was to remain Amos's best-known novel, and become a landmark in post-war English fiction, though now Lucky Jim looks like nothing more nor less than the propitious start to Amos's long career. In the 1950s it looked as though it was going to be the start of something bigger or wider. It was seen as the signpost to a new trend in English writing, or even two trends. 9. Movements. In early 1954, a squally correspondence broke out in the pages of The Spectator. It began with a hostile review, in the 8th of January issue, of Edith Sitwell's new book of poems, Gardeners and Astronomers, by the magazine's poetry editor, Anthony Hartley. Feeling his way through admittedly tricky poetic terrain, Hartley came down on the side of our young academic poets, the university wits, Kingsley Amis and Donald Davy, for example, and against what he called the neo-symbolists, to whose camp he assigned Sitwell. 2 weeks later she wrote from Hollywood to defend herself, and to denounce, no doubt with Amis and Davy in mind, little Mr. Tompkins, this week's new great poet. In the next issue, who should pop up in the letters column alongside John Wayne and Elizabeth Jennings to defend Hartley, but little Mr. Tompkins himself, name and address supplied. Taking issue on a point of Sitwellian imagery, personally I think the sap of a tree is more like double diamond than peridots and beryls. Little Mr. Tompkins signed off, "It just shows how we great poets differ." Sitwell came back fighting with another letter the next week, and on the 15th of February J.D. Scott, the Spectator's literary editor, rang Hilary Rubinstein to tell him that Sitwell had sent yet another letter, saying that however much she might disagree with Hartley, she agreed with him on one thing: "I have read Kingsley Amis's most remarkable, most distinguished first novel, Lucky Jim, with enthusiastic admiration." She had already written to Amis himself, care of his publisher, and to Victor Gollancz directly, expressing her enthusiasm for the novel. "There is no doubt Queen Edith is crazy about your book," Rubinstein wrote to Amis 2 days after Scott's telephone call. But he added, Scott had told him the joyful irony of this, which made me sick with laughter. The letter from Sitwell containing her unsolicited testimonial for Lucky Jim duly appeared in the next Spectator. The following week, the irony that had made Rubinstein sick laughing was revealed in a letter from Amis. "I am sincerely grateful to her," he wrote. "At the same time I feel I should point out that I myself am little Mr. Tompkins." It was Amis who had abused his influential fan under pseudonymous cover, though he had not known of Sitwell's enthusiasm for his novel when he first adopted it. When he knew what she thought, he became uneasy about not owning up. He told Larkin that he felt he would get branded mean sod, bloody fool, if he did not express some regret. Sitwell forgave Amis and even proposed inviting him to lunch, at which she promised he would find her oblivious to what had happened between them. The lunch duly took place in the summer at the Sesame, Imperial and Pioneer Club. Amis described it to Larkin a few weeks later. "Had a corking fine lunch with my pal the Dame. Actually, it was rather on the dull side, thank God. Rather like lunching with a kindly maiden aunt who wants to show you she's interested in all that writing you're doing." Others present included the wheelchair-bound John Hayward, T.S. Eliot's long-term companion. Amos found it curious, almost macabre, to hear the dame ask Hayward to give Tom her love. John and James Pope Hennessy, and Alan Price Jones, the editor of the Times literary supplement, who was very oily to the dame. Things passed off peaceably enough, though there was a horrid moment when Sitwell, looking at Amos, declared, "Of course there is just one thing which is absolutely unforgivable." Pause. That is to attack someone anonymously. Amos felt like an Indian brave whose horse runs away with him at the moment he realizes the white men he is charging have repeating rifles. But he need not have worried. The dame was referring to a monstrous profile of herself in the New Statesman. "I fair peed myself in relief," Amos told Larkin. This little literary teacup storm is amusing, though not in itself important. But it says something about the casual way in which Amos got caught up in literary circles and became identified with the movements of the 1950s, the movement itself, and later the angry young men. Here is not the place to disentangle the intricacies of these movements, or even to discuss whether they had sufficient substance to deserve any such title. But both had one thing in common at least. They were not the result of young writers sitting down to concoct a literary manifesto, then following it passionately through. Things happened more the other way about. Movements were declared to exist, then writers thought suitable were recruited to join them. They were the products of publicity, with a good deal of chance thrown in, rather than of any concerted literary program. In the early 1950s, literary circles seemed imbued with an air of disappointed expectancy, like people waiting at a station platform where the train did not arrive at the time expected, or when it did, failed to disgorge any glamorous passengers. This was not how it had been in the first half of the century, when literary movements had turned up regularly, and in forms readily categorizable by decade or common purpose. There were, among others, Edwardians and Georgians, the Bloomsbury Group, and the left-wing writers of the 1930s. Admittedly, there had been a bit of a gap in the 1940s, with nothing much new to fill it up besides Dylan Thomas. As a source of literary inspiration, the Second World War itself had turned out more disappointing than the First, its more promising young poets having either been killed early, Sidney Keyes, Keith Douglas, Alan Lewis, or not been called up to fight, Philip Larkin, John Wayne, John Heath Stubbs, or dodged conscription like Dylan Thomas. But that decade was past, and the question now was, where were the new writers of the 1950s, and what was their message? It seemed there was none of either. In the farewell editorial, Cyril Connolly wrote, for the last edition of his magazine Horizon at the end of 1949, he moaned with weary fastidiousness, "It is closing time in the gardens of the West, and from now on an artist will be judged only by the resonance of his solitude or the quality of his despair." Bidding farewell to Horizon in the New Statesman soon afterwards, T.C. Worsley noted, 5 years after the war, there is still no sign of any kind of literary revival. No movements are discernible, no trends. Here was a vacuum waiting to be filled, and much casting around went into filling it. John Wayne's appointment to the BBC's first reading programme was one attempt to find someone who might be able to do so. Various claims were made that a movement had been detected, though its membership and identity tended to fluctuate according to who was making the claim. Amos himself was aware that some sort of movement was in the air, but what was it all about, and who was in it? "There's no doubt, we are getting to be a movement," he told Larkin in March 1954, "even if the only people in it we like, apart from ourselves, are each other." Personally, Amos didn't give a pinch of shit for old Al Alvarez's stuff, nor Donald Davies, nor old John Barry Wayne's really much. That much or less left the movement to be made up of himself and Larkin wasn't pulling his weight in it because he was failing to produce any fiction. For God's sake, man, turn out something in the fiction line. You flat-faced pullet. But Larkin never did write another novel after Jill and A Girl in Winter. John Wayne described the policy for his radio program as one of consolidation, a reaction against modernism, a return to traditional forms. But this was of its nature vague and hardly much of a rallying cry for new writers. Other banners were tentatively hung out. Wayne himself tried a new Elizabethan era, Hartley, the University Wits, and the Metaphysicals, Donald Davy, the New Augustans. But none of these caught on. Then, in an editorial in The Spectator on the 1st of October 1954, J.D. Scott adroitly capitalized the hitherto lowercase letter M and announced the movement. This was, Scott later acknowledged, a more or less calculated publicity stunt, an attempt to liven up the literary pages as part of a campaign to boost the magazine's declining sales. Nevertheless, this label stuck, as others had not, and Amis was inevitably stuck with it. Wayne was also enlisted as part of the movement. So was Iris Murdoch, whose first novel, Under the Net, appeared the same year, to a highly favourable review from Amis. Other members seemed to be Donald Davey, John Holloway, Elizabeth Jennings, Philip Larkin, Robert Conquest, and Tom Gunn. Membership became largely a matter of getting poems accepted in collections like D.J. Enright's Poets of the 1950s, or Conquest's New Lines. Sympathetic writers who did not succeed in getting into those volumes, like Philip Oakes and Anthony Thwaite, were classed as allies or associates. Sympathetic writers who did not succeed in getting into those volumes, like Philip Oakes and Anthony Thwaite, were classed as allies or associates. It was by another trick of chance, one even more obviously the result of the vagaries of publicity, that The Angry Young Men appeared from nowhere. This followed the production of John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger at the Royal Court in May 1956. Although well received by some critics, especially Kenneth Tynan, the play did not do well at the box office. Until, that is, the theatre's press officer, George Fearon, was struck by a flash of apparently off-the-cuff genius. Asked by a journalist what he thought of John Osborne, Fearon replied that he supposed Osborne was a very angry young man. Osborne himself repeated the phrase on television soon afterwards, and it began to take off, as did Osborne's play. Amis was the only writer to find himself a fully paid-up member of both groups. Unlike other movement members, he attracted publicity beyond small circulation magazines or the review columns of the quality press. His first experience of this sort was with the journalist Dan Farson, who wrote to ask him if he might interview him for the London Evening Standard. They fixed to meet at Cardiff, seen by Farson as an adequate compromise between London and Swansea, with the extra advantage, as Amis advised him, of a decent restaurant to lunch at, and he turned up with his friend Francis Bacon, the painter, in tow. After lunch, while Farson went for a stroll around the docks, Bacon showed Amis a magazine of homosexual soft porn and asked if he was interested. Amis said no, wondering whether perhaps Bacon had come all this way to meet him on the off chance that he might share Bacon's sexual bent. Farson's article eventually appeared on the 4th of May 1956. 2 months later, Farson took things a significant stage further. He had become friendly with Colin Wilson, author of the hastily acclaimed work of quasi-philosophy The Outsider, and he arranged for John Osborne to be present at a celebration party of Wilson's, along with another new playwright, Michael Hastings, and Mary Ure, the actress who had the part of Alison in Osborne's play. She got drunk, as did Hastings. Nevertheless, in 2 articles for the Daily Mail, Farson contrived to construct from this unpromising start a new movement, consisting of the 3 partygoers, Wilson, Osborne, and Hastings, plus Amis. 2 weeks later, the Daily Express joined them with an article by John Barber, which lumped the same 4 together for the first time as Angry Young Men. So were launched the 2 groups into which Amis was corralled willy-nilly. To the press, popular and quality, the groups had the advantage of vagueness in both identity and membership, enabling them to be endlessly examined and discussed, and approved or deplored according to taste. New names could be added to the list of angries as they arrived, as were John Braine, with his first novel Room at the Top, and Arnold Wesker, with his first play Chicken Soup with Barley. Others could be quietly dropped from the running when deemed to have failed, as was Colin Wilson when his second book flopped. New angles on the youth theme could be struck by finding even younger writers to publicize, as happened when, following the lead of the French writer Françoise Séguin, whose novel Bonjour Tristesse was published when she was 19 in 1954, the English went one better by discovering Jane Gaskell, aged 16, and already author of Strange Evil. Yet more tenuous connections could be made, with the emergence of homegrown rock and roll stars like Tommy Steele, or the American beat writers like Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs. Protest, foggy and formless though it might be, was in the air, and it came as no surprise that angries like Osborne and Braine, though not Amis, should take part in the demonstrations for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, launched in 1958. For Amos there was more literary substance to membership of the movement than in being an angry young man. The movement at least contained friends who could help each other get published and broadcast, or give genuinely useful literary advice, as Larkin did with Lucky Jim, and as Amos reciprocated by criticizing Larkin's poems. The Angries were not his friends, though John Brain became one later, and there was to be more than a little of him in the Yorkshire-born Pope of Amos's 1976 novel The Alteration. Amos met Osborne more often at the Garrick Club in the 90s than he ever did in the 50s, though he had little more to say to him then than earlier. To Colin Wilson's Outsider, Amos gave an unfavourable review in The Spectator. Wilson wrote him a 2-page letter by return, and called on him in Swansea. But Amos did his best to avoid him thereafter, finding his interest in serial murders scarily sinister. Wilson, however, sometimes proved hard to elude. Amos once gave a reason for not meeting him a party he had to attend at Brown's Hotel in London, only to find Wilson turning up there uninvited. Amos also avoided Wesker, though for different reasons. He disliked Wesker's plays very much indeed, and found Wesker's self-assured indifference to his dislike hard to take. Celebrity Amos thought of as no more than a useful means of promoting book sales, and considering how well known he became, remained surprisingly cautious about publicity through the 50s. He declined opportunities to broadcast, for instance, except when he could do so on his own terms, responding to a 1956 invitation from the BBC to take part in a discussion on the Bloomsbury Group. Amos took care to set out his stall. A. I'm against Bloomsbury, though not, I hope, violently or crusadingly so. B. I know most about, and most dislike, Virginia Woolf of the Bloomsbury set. I promise to be reasonable about her, though hostile. More often, though, he turned down invitations altogether. In January 1957 he refused a chance to discuss a Fabian pamphlet he had written on the air. I'm no good at discussions, he wrote, and on this sort of topic the other chaps would just make mincemeat of me. In July he refused a chance to appear on another discussion programme, Give and Take. I'm afraid the programme you describe, he wrote to Hugh Weldon, its producer, is not for me. I can never think of the really telling retort until afterwards. In November he accepted an invitation to talk face-to-face with Anthony Powell, but turned down one to appear on Woman's Hour. Live microphones terrify me, and I've sworn off them for the next quarter of a century. This was an exaggeration. He was to become at ease in front of the microphone, and later the camera, even in the 60s interviewing a series of pop stars for television. Having a job, a home, and a family in Swansea helped Amos avoid the worst pitfalls of celebrity. Life, though, became fuller. He began to keep a diary, and one friend, Clive Gammon, remembers Amos' slight air of embarrassment when he rang to fix a date for a drink, and Amos asked him to hold on while he looked in his book. Amos liked going to London, and did so more often than before, but he kept his sense of proportion. As a means of shortening your lifespan, but good, I heartily recommend London. He wrote in the Daily Express at the end of 1957, Nowadays, after about 72 hours of as much richer food, stronger drink, etc. as I can stand, I beat it for the Welsh marshes with all the enthusiasm of an ancient Celt pursued by Saxons. Reflecting on the business of celebrity in his memoirs, Amos wondered if he had done the right thing when he started the ball rolling with Farson. Doing it once meant doing it again, and things like appearing on television, giving quotes over the telephone about how you will be voting at the next election, or spending Christmas, helping to advertise a brand of beer, all that. The alternative was to say nothing for 20 years, after which you may condescend to be photographed with your face mostly hidden, preferably in a foreign magazine, and expect to be taken seriously by some sorts of people. Without knowing it, he was casting a die when he met Farson, but he concluded, not a very important one. Perhaps, though, it mattered more than he thought. By becoming a publicly known figure, Amos acquired an identity and an image, which were easily confused with his work and blurred the intended distance between himself and his novels. The temptation to see real people in fiction grew all the stronger when readers believed they knew what the author was really like. On the face of it, much of Jim could be found in Amos. Provincial lecturer, fond of cigarettes, booze, girls, a puller of funny faces, irreverent, a lefty, and a bit of an anti-intellectual, if not an outright Philistine to boot. Thus, in the public mind, Kingsley Amos merged into Lucky Jim. They became one another. When in 1967 Amos published an article which had been given the headline, "Why Lucky Jim Turned Right," nobody had to be told that it was about himself, and his own change of politics, not Lucky Jim's. With articles like this, his image began to change, and eventually to change radically into more or less the exact opposite of Jim. Amos as clubman, curmudgeon, anti-trendy, Tory, misogynist, blimp, with only a fondness for drink connecting him to the old image. One way or another, Amos seemed always to project a stereotype of himself, even to relish promoting the more extreme versions of his own caricature. He often got irritated at the way he was identified with characters in his fiction, so that people thought he was, say, as much of a misogynist as Jake Richardson in his 1978 novel Jake's Thing. Why can't people realize that novelists actually make up their characters, he will querulously ask. But such confusions, always possible, are perhaps inevitably intensified by the fitful and uncertain illuminations of publicity. Amos's horizons expanded steadily through the 1950s. He went to London more often after Lucky Jim was published, and made new friends there. The first was Roger Conquest, the Anglo-American poet, later celebrated as the historian of communist crimes, who endeared himself to Amos by reciting his own long sequel to Eskimo Nell at a party in Chelsea in 1952, held to celebrate a new pen anthology of poems in which both Amos and Conquest appeared. Anthony Powell wrote to Amos after he had his first book review published in The Spectator. It was about James Thurber, and in it Amos remarked on Powell as a serious writer who was also funny. Amos told Larkin that Powell found his style very sympathetic. This out-of-the-blue approach from a writer he greatly admired bucked Amos up considerably, and he found himself imagining for Larkin's benefit a conversation 15 years hence, by which time Powell would be dead and Amos would be able to report him as having said, "Kingsley, you're the one we all look to keep the English novel going when we go." Amos met the journalist George Gale at a Spectator party in the middle of the decade. He began to correspond with John Betjeman when Lucky Jim was published and got to know him early in the 1960s. Increasingly often, his new friends would come to visit Amos in Swansea, and he, like Robin Davies in You Can't Do Both, who also became a lecturer at a provincial university, would visit their homes or make short trips, which would include one night or possibly two in London, and an assortment of meals, drinks, recordings with publishers, agents, BBC men, not forgetting friends. Amos described such a trip to Larkin in 1954. First he went to Oxford, to a party at All Souls, and dinner with friends afterwards. Next day he went with Hilly and Bruce Montgomery to London. There he met the Spectator lot, who all seemed very decent. Then it was on to a tremendous lunch at Montgomery's club, after which they met Tony Hartley and John Scott of the Spectator in a pub. From there, Hartley, Hilly and I went and saw Ken Tynan and his wife Elaine Dundee, but I was so pissed I could hardly speak. Black coffee was produced, and Amos proceeded to another pub, where he found himself advancing towards Harry Hoff, William Cooper, Bruce and C.P. Snow sitting in a line. Hoff greeted me by saying, "Here's Amos, but too drunk, I see, to say much." Amos, however, managed to get quite a lot said, though he could not remember much of it afterwards. The next day he and Hilly drank with P.A. Newby, a small, rather nasty man with apostolic eyes, and picked up Powell at 1 p.m., the nicest man we met. Powell variously expressed admiration for Proust, affection for Graham Greene, though not for his books, sorrow for Evelyn Waugh, and liking for David Cecil, whose fag Powell was at Eton, though no liking for Cecil's books either. Later they returned to Oxford with Montgomery for a brains trust, whose members included C.S. Lewis, G.S. Fraser, James Kirkup, and Amos. I was sullen, jerky, and facetious by turns. It was out of these trips that Amos's weekly lunches at Bertorelli's in due course emerged. These became mildly notorious as the fascist lunches in the 1960s and 1970s, because of the right-wingers who often went to them. But they started out as a convenient arrangement for Amos. If he turned up in London on a certain day, he could be reasonably sure of finding sympathetic people to lunch with. These trips also provided useful cover for assignations with women, for both Robin Davies and Amos. Not that Amos had to go to London for that. He had affairs with women in Swansea too. To one, whom he called Oligadora, he wrote a rather bitter short poem of that name in which he described her reaction to a gift. "This is too little. Am I in default, or are you grasping? Which of us shows more inadequacy? Contemplating the attractions of some of his female students, Robin Davies thinks that the only reason he doesn't go after them is fear of the sack, to avoid which he follows the advice never to lay a finger on them till they graduate, given him by a veteran Ulsterman with teaching experience in India, a man who sounds very like Amos's Swansea colleague Joe Bartley, described in his memoirs as an Ulsterman who, with a second to live down, had taught in India, though Bartley did not give Amos the same advice. But Robin concedes to himself that his resolution on the point might wilt one day. Amos certainly wilted, women students not being excluded from his conquests. Amos made little effort to avoid temptation. Quite the opposite. He seized every chance of sexual adventure he could. "Will alert you to my next visit," he wrote to Conquest from Swansea in November 1956. "May want to borrow your flat at times, like the early evening, for an hour or two, to entertain a young lady. You bachelors have got to stand by us married men, you know." A year later he involved Conquest in an elaborate alibi. "Visited London briefly last week and meant to see you. Indeed, rang you Thursday and Friday evening. However, I used you as an alibi on Friday afternoon, while I was in fact with, guess what, a young lady. But if it ever comes up, please note that on Friday 13th of September you and I, A, met at lunchtime, B, wandered about in the afternoon, C, parted about 6 p.m., D, were accompanied by a vague cousin or brother-in-law of yours, a nice circumstantial touch, I thought, E, we're going to meet again in the evening, but when I phoned by arrangement circa 8 p.m., you said you couldn't make it. Okay? You know I do the same for you any old time, eh?" At the beginning of 1958 he again involved Conquest in a cover-up, this time over an affair with a Swansea woman. "As you can see," he wrote, "there's a little chore I'd like you to do for me, if you would be so good as to put the enclosed in the post and keep your trap shut with reference thereto thereafter. I'm sure you see the point. A London postmark is insufficiently specific to catch the husbandly eye, but a Swansea one points straight to yours truly. Do the same for you some day." Sometimes these little stratagems of deception did not quite work out as planned, with results that can now seem hilarious, though surely did not seem so to Amos at the time. Writing from the address of the English department at Swansea in December 1960, Amos asked Conquest for use of a bed, even as he urged him to be careful. "Now listen, can you fix me up with a bed for tomorrow week, 19th December, from say 11:30 a.m. onwards? Reply, if you will, to the above address, not Glanmore Road, because a fault in my security system has led Hilly to connect a Conquest letter with an impending Amos screw. And you at your end can help by not telling Desmond Williams this time, or anyone else at any time for the matter of that, what I'm up to. So please, chum, no leaks to anyone on this. And Christ, as you'll readily understand, what buggered me was having to serve my sentence without having had a chance to commit the fucking crime, so to speak." Infuriatingly, Hilly had caught him out in an act he had not got around to committing. Amos was not unhappy or unsatisfied with Hilly, but he could not or did not turn down any promising chance of going to bed with another woman that presented itself. His opportunism in these matters was prodigious throughout his married life. Once, much later, while staying with other couples for the weekend, he found himself having to give a warmly ingratiating smile to all the women at the breakfast table, being boozily unable to remember which one of them it was he had made love to the night before. Another time he was invited to dinner by a married woman, with whom he was having an affair. The woman's husband was there, as was Hilly, and a third couple made up the dinner party. Amos contrived to make a date with the wife in this third couple behind the backs of his own wife, his hostess lover, and 2 husbands. The subsequent fling started out in farcical style when he had to see off a window cleaner who was about to get to work on the windows of the maisonette Amos had borrowed for the occasion, and it continued bizarrely when the woman revealed herself to be an enthusiastic masochist and her husband a sadist. This came as a surprise to Amos, because both seemed utterly conventional in outward appearance and behaviour, indeed in intimate behaviour too, since the wife's revelation came immediately after a perfectly straightforward and thoroughly enjoyable sexual act. But that other side of sex did not appeal to him. He once tried an experiment with his second wife involving a hairbrush, but when neither got any kind of thrill out of it, they quickly desisted and resumed conventional relations. Amos may have been a Don Juan in his day, but he was never a Dessard at any time. The Don Juan character is sometimes thought to be motivated by dislike, even hatred, of women, and there have been times when Amos has speculated whether this was his motive for chasing them. But in his earlier years, at least, he seems genuinely to have liked women, as well as wanting to go to bed with them. Women friends from his time in Swansea remember him as being unusually interested in them as people, as human beings, instead of as the sexual prey, which was the role into which prevailing male attitudes preferred to cast them. Amos certainly thought liking women was an important thing for a man to do. In a 1963 BBC Woman's Hour broadcast under the title Letter to Someone's Son, he chose to make this his theme. "Yes, I know it sounds absurd," he declares in his script. "Every normal bloke likes women, doesn't he?" But his own answer to that was a very emphatic no. He had some difficulty defining what he meant by liking women beyond it being obviously to do with responding to all feminine qualities, not just the specifically sexual ones. Nevertheless, he had no difficulty defining how men who liked women behaved towards them. They treat them with genuine and continuing affectionate interest. There were more men who disliked women, he thought, than women who disliked men, and there were other kinds of differences which told against men. When a woman misused her sexual qualities, she did so to get what she wanted, as when a woman driver fluttered her eyelashes at an irate policeman. Yet a man often used his as a way of being nasty to a woman, by turning on the charm, say, making a date, and then failing to turn up. For all sorts of reasons, economic, social, biological, psychological, men have it in their power to damage women far more severely than women can damage men. A man who realizes he has this power and never uses it is a man who likes women. Ordinary kindness, he thought, was a much more significant part of man's attractions than more showy displays. A girl dislikes unkindness more than lack of skill in the twist, prefers affection to an expensive dinner, and would rather get a letter from you than a pair of sharp earrings. Amos found another kind of difference between men and women, which he described in a poem, A Bookshop Idyll. Imagining himself leafing through an anthology of new poems, the poet thinks them immediately divisible by their author's sex. Men's poems have titles like Landscape Near Parma, or The Double Vortex, whereas the women's are called things like I Remember You, or Love Is My Creed. Man's love is of man's life a thing apart. Girls aren't like that. We men have got love well weighed up. Our stuff can get by without it. Women don't seem to think that's good enough. They write about it. Never mind the awful way their poems lay them open. Women are really much nicer than men. No wonder we like them. In their poems, men like to show off how clever they are, while women try to get to grips with love. But perhaps men are not confident enough to write about love, and so find it more convenient to forget those times we sat up half the night, chock full of love, crammed with bright thoughts, names, rhymes, and couldn't write. Neither men nor women understand love, but women at least realize its importance, while men think it's enough to be clever. Amos liked women, so why not enjoy as many of them as possible? There is a sort of logic to that, which Robin Davies takes to its furthest extreme. It had even occurred to him that sticking firmly to one girl could be unethically used to obtain exemption from the sometimes grueling task of promiscuity. So you can, if you really work hard at it, make sleeping around seem like the tougher, therefore ethically sounder option. In one part of his mind, Amos seems genuinely to have thought of sex on the side as a child might think of a slice of cake, as a treat, and in an adult no more heinous a crime than having, say, an extra couple of large ones in the pub beyond the usual ration. This sense of sex as an enjoyable perk to be taken as a side dish to the main meal of a happy marriage is caught in a letter Amos sent to Robert Conquest in November 1957. Sex recedes a bit, though maritally I have nothing whatever to complain about, and I had a very funny, ha-ha, extramarital one the other day, which I'll tell you about. You'll be the ideal audience for it. Why isn't there more of that kind of thing? Why, Amos might have been asking, couldn't a man have his cake and eat it too? But in another part of his mind, which Amos did his best to keep at arm's length from the first part, he knew perfectly well that there was more to sex than a bit of fun. In a poem, Nothing to Fear, Amos describes his feelings on turning up at a flat for an assignation. In his own parallel experience, a flat loaned him by Conquest. All fixed. Early arrival at the flat lent by a friend whose note says, lucky sod. When Conquest read this poem, he wired up his flat with a tape recorder, so that the next time Amos borrowed it for sexual purposes, the words "lucky sod" sounded alarmingly the moment he switched on the lights. Sometimes Amos found Conquest's practical joking a little hard to bear. Drinks on the tray, the cover story pat and quite uncheckable, her husband off somewhere with all the kids till 6 o'clock, which ought to be quite long enough, and all worthwhile, face really beautiful, good legs and hips, and as for breasts, my God. So far so good. Everything is in order, and a good time is about to be had. Then the poet has a momentary qualm, which he quickly brushes aside. What about guilt, compunction, and such stuff? I've had my fill of all that cock. It'll wear off, as usual. But something else suddenly takes the place of guilt. Slight trembling, dry mouth, quick pulse rate, sweaty hands. It isn't that the woman he is waiting for is the first, nor that he is impatient for her to arrive, nor is it fear of failure, thank you, Jack. He tells himself he is impervious to the dangers of beauty. Its touch will burn, but I'm asbestos, see? So, what has brought on this feeling of terror? Sitting here, a bag of glands, turned up to concert pitch, I seem to sense a different style of caller at my back, as cold as ice, but just as keen on me. Waiting for his girl to arrive has led him to imagine death calling in her place. The poet tries to write this off as a dead coincidence. But is it? Or is it a supremely acute sense of guilt surfacing from some unfathomable depth, from deposits laid down heaven knows when and made up of God knows what ingredients? Perhaps something to do with his parents' prudishness, or his feelings about Hilly. Who can say what forces have combined to forge this new anxiety, this completely unlooked-for association between death and adultery? Death, as the associative sex on the side, is an extreme expression in Amos's work of his anxieties about his own behaviour, but it is by no means the only one. Such anxieties, indeed, show themselves in his work from beginning to end. Relations between men and women are his most persistent theme, in particular the way men treat women, more often than not badly. Adulterous husbands are prominent in Amos's novels, from his second, That Uncertain Feeling, to his latest, You Can't Do Both, and it is possible to see Amos examining his own concerns about his own behaviour in many of them. That Uncertain Feeling, published in 1955 and set in the not un-Swansea-like Welsh town of Aberdarsey, is the story of a librarian, John Lewis, who has an affair with Elizabeth Griffith Williams, the wife of a local councillor, who has the clout to get Lewis the promotion he wants. Having been faithful to his own wife, Jean, throughout their 5 years of marriage, John Lewis keeps his distance for a while, but eventually succumbs after a beach party on the evening of the day he has been interviewed for the promotion by a committee headed by Elizabeth's husband. He is worried about his chances, but after they've made love, Elizabeth tells him he needn't be. Her husband has fixed it up for him to get the job, whatever the committee thinks of his interview, whereupon Lewis summons up the scruples to turn it down, on the grounds that it is a dirty deal. Elizabeth is contemptuous. I suppose adultery isn't a dirty deal, according to your way of thinking, she says. You and your conscience are quite happy about that, eh? When Lewis reveals to his wife that he has both turned down the job and slept with Elizabeth, about whom Jean has had suspicions for some time, she is contemptuous in her own way, too. Don't she and the children need the extra money that goes with the promotion? But she is hurt far more than she is worried about cash. Whatever you told me about having Elizabeth couldn't be as bad as what I felt when I realized what you were thinking about that Elizabeth and preferring her to me. That was the worst time. She goes on to pour scorn over his whole attitude to sex. Yes, I know a bit of chasing round after another woman now and then doesn't matter, according to you, as long as there isn't too much of it. Well, according to me, a bit does matter. A bit's too much. Anything at all of that sort matters, according to me. She even admits falsely that she has had a fling of her own with Gareth Probert, the local stage Welsh poet-playwright. Her anger and despair frighten Lewis. He rushes out of the house and gets involved in an absurd brawl. When he calms down, he asks himself what he's going to do. Since I seem to have piloted myself into the position of being immoral and moral at the same time, the thing was to keep trying not to be immoral, and then to keep trying might turn into a habit. But he knows this will not be easy. I was always, at least until I reached the climacteric, going to be pulled two ways, and keeping the pull from going the wrong way, or trying to, would have to take the place for me of stability and consistency. Not giving up was the important thing. The plot of this novel is entirely fictitious. No wife of an influential local councillor able to do Amos a favour came his way in Swansea, but the feelings of John Lewis and his wife Jean and the arguments between them reflect those of Amos and Hilly. She bitter at his infidelity, he all too well aware of her bitterness. There were rows in the Amos household too, real ding-dong affairs, which on occasion the three Amos children would sit on the stairs to hear with tears in their eyes, not quite knowing what it was all about, but hoping it would soon be over. John Lewis, however, is careful not to commit himself never to straying again after his adultery has been discovered. The most he will commit himself to do is to try harder. So it was with Amos. He too thought he must try to behave better, while at the same time recognizing that he could give no guarantees. As a forecast of Amos's own behaviour until he reached his own climacteric, John Lewis's permanent tug-of-war between his worse and better selves was to turn out all too close to the truth, with Amos's better self losing the struggle more often than not. When he is wondering whether to marry Nancy, Robin Davies imagines his future with Nancy passing round cucumber sandwiches to other fecund young mums, while he craned out of the box-room window with a telescope pointed at a girls' school playground with a stand up to his neck. This obstinate rantiness has a ring of Amos in Swansea, even in detail. Writing to Conquest in April 1956, soon after moving to a new house at 53 Glanmore Road, Amos said, "Got a nice big study, but the girls from the school up the road keep coming past and taking my mind off my work. Never mind, one's got to keep in touch with one's mania." The Greek word mania meaning passion. Not the same as mania, see? But Hilly had found her own way of striking back. In Swansea she began to have flings of her own. One of these seemed likely to pose a serious threat to the Amoses' marriage, when what had started as an affair turned into something more. In October 1956, divorce itself emerged as a possibility. A decision would be reached, Amos told Larkin, in the course of the next few months, so that the amorous pair can decide whether they are the victims of an infatuation or of something more important. Amos thought his marriage had about 1 chance in 4 of surviving till next summer. He was not pleased with this, especially as it might very well include separation from his children, about whom I feel strongly. During the interlude, while a decision is being awaited on divorce, there will be none of the old marital rites engaged in here, naturally. This has all been rather diminutory of the gaiety of nations, inhibitory of general merriment, etc., as you can imagine. Having one's wife fucked is one thing, having her taken away from you, plus your children, is another, I find. Amos had not told anybody else, and he swore Larkin to secrecy. He reckoned that if it came to divorce, he would resign from Swansea and perhaps move to London. It'll be odd to be a bachelor again. Matters swayed to and fro for several weeks, but by the 20th of November Amos felt able to tell Larkin that Hilly's affair had quietened down a lot since I last wrote. My marriage now has the odds heavily on its side. He had been planning to visit Larkin in Hull a couple of days later, but sent him a telegram to cancel, explaining in a letter dispatched on the same day that it was not only Hilly who had been giving him sleepless nights. My young lady, whom I was rather attached to, has just decided to give me up, and all this sort of stuff gives me great physical fatigue apart from anything else. He simply could not face the 12.5-hour journey to Hull. By the 6th of December, though, Amos was declaring himself to be less of a misery now. Hilly had agreed to give up her lover for 6 months, marital relations were to be resumed, and there was to be increased cordiality between husband and wife. And that is sodding good believe me, sport. A bonus to this new harmony was also thrown in. As a consequence, though I can quite see how you can't quite see that this can be so, I've got my girlfriend back too. Amos, with both wife and girlfriend quiescent, pronounced his love life to be quite near an even keel at the moment. Amos's idea of an even keel might not have been everybody's. Still, the marriage kept afloat. In August 1958, Amos felt able to tell Larkin that he and Hilly were on superlative terms. By the end of the following year, though, the relationship had plunged back into stormy waters, as he explained to Larkin. Talking of adultery, my activities in this direction, which have ramified some of the last few months, received a severe check when Hilly found some letters. I had received, and initiated the most strenuous and painful row we have ever had. I'm to give all that up, it appears, with an exemption clause covering my Yank girl, acquired during a year spent teaching at Princeton, when she turns up over here in the summer. Trouble is, it's so hard to give all that up. Habit of years and all that, and such bloody good fun, too. Especially just after finding the most splendid, busty redhead in an ideal location. But being walked out on by H and the kids, the surefire consequence of any further discovery, is a rather unwelcome prospect, too. You can't have it both ways, you see. But both ways was how Amos did try to have it, until not very long afterwards he discovered the truth of his own judgment, that having it both ways really was impossible. Amos joined the army a communist, and left it a committed socialist supporter of the Labour Party. Thereafter he moved to the right, though in fits and starts, but he was shaping up to be a free marketeer in matters of art long before he became one in politics. From an early age, Amos believed that the writer should satisfy his audience or go to the wall, just like the businessman. His attitudes were shaped partly by his own tastes and partly by his origins. Amos genuinely liked the popular art, films, science fiction, jazz, which he had started to enjoy at school and continued to enjoy for the rest of his life, though the forms he took pleasure in were to vary over the years. Science fiction, for instance, fell from favour, while television rose into it. Coming, too, from lower-middle-class Norbury, Amos was consistently on his guard against anything that looked like the takeover of culture by a self-styled superior class. The traditional upper class was the obvious enemy here, but it was not the only one. Any group that tried to seize hold of art for itself and defend it against the hordes of plain people was just as offensive to him. The upper class marked itself off from the herd by its money, speech, clubs, schools, and so forth. A literary upper class might achieve the same effect by obscurity, complexity, and other bars to common understanding, which fenced off their literary property from ordinary readers. This, to Amos, was simply snobbery by other means. Something of his feelings shows through in a letter Amos wrote in May 1947, in which he told Larkin he was no end pleased to hear that his friend had got something together for Lilliput, a popular men's magazine of the period. Amos was beginning to think that Larkin had got a bit high and mighty, when The Girl in Winter, Larkin's second novel, went over so well with the highbrow critics on its publication 3 months earlier. Larkin, Amos feared, might be going to turn into one of those people like Aldous Huxley or D.E. Lawrence. A deliberate ambiguity. Who go off into an ivory tower and consider the ordinary reading public beneath their notice. Amos pronounced himself very bucked to think that Larkin was not going to give himself airs like that, and that he'd seen that writing for the man in the street is the only decent ambition a man of letters can have these days. This was not only a question of the artistic side of things. Larkin would never secure his bread and butter by obscure, sexy, clever stuff. Amos recommended that he get a reviewer's job on a decent paper, and then he might end up as the Frank Swinnerton or Hugh Walpole of the 1960s. Think it over, he urged his friend. If Amos set his sights a bit low here, he surely aimed higher for Larkin and himself than Walpole or Swinnerton. He was pointing at what was for him the right target. A writer, in his view, must aim to be read, to avoid snobbery and exclusiveness, and, not least, to make a living. Amos changed his mind about how a writer should set about achieving these things over the years. He himself was to spend 13 years as a university lecturer before he became an independent freelance writer, while Larkin remained a librarian poet for the rest of his life. But Amos never changed his mind that those were the things a writer should aim to achieve. And he never became too grand to refuse work at the Lilliput level, provided he could write what he wanted and get a decent return for his efforts. Amos's literary tastes were strictly in line with these ideas. He was choosy, but he chose from the mainstream and rejected the experimental, the willfully obscure, and the snobbishly exclusive. In December 1952 he rearranged his bookcase in order to assemble what he described to Larkin as his vital books on a single shelf. The list reveals the man. It consisted of volumes of poetry by W. H. Auden, John Betjeman, Lawrence Durrell, Piss John Donne, Andrew Marvell, Alfred Barron Tennyson, William Wordsworth, W. B. Yeats, and Piss Robert Graves, Works of fiction by John Dickson Carr, Cyril Connolly, Graham Greene, Julian Hall, Christopher Isherwood, James Joyce. Amos liked the early fiction, but not Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake. Henri de Montellon, Flann O'Brien, Anthony Powell, and works of general interest by Cyril Connolly, William Empson. Add Piss William Empson to the list of poetry. Graham Greene, Arthur Hutchings, a companion to Mozart's pianoforte concertos. Piss Robert Graves, Q.D. Leavis, W. Somerset Maugham, and Stephen Potter. Not farking gamesman shit, etc., but the Muse in Chains. Larkin's The North Ship would be added, if I ever get hold of another copy, as would Larkin's novel Jill and A Girl in Winter, when I get them back from loan. Alexander Pope's poetry should be on the shelf too, as should George Herbert's. Writers like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Dylan Thomas, D.H. Lawrence, and all the Bloomsbury were missing as well, but by Amos's deliberate decision. The choice he had agreed with his supervisor of a subject for his Oxford thesis showed something more of his concern for the proper relationship between artist and audience. His subject was English non-dramatic poetry 1850 to 1900, and the Victorian reading public. And in 156 pages his thesis explored the ways in which poets in that period reached their readers. In 1952 he abbreviated part of the thesis to a dozen pages for publication in Essays in Criticism, under the title Communication and the Victorian Poet. Essays in Criticism was then edited by F.W. Bateson, who had supervised Amos's thesis. In both essay and thesis, Amos divides his poets into two broad groups. The first is of those anxious to communicate with an audience and usually keen, as a first step, to get the critical approval of a circle of friends. The second is of poets more or less indifferent to their readers. Dante Gabriel Rossetti is the hero of the first group. Rossetti wrote, "Above all ideal personalities with which the poet must learn to identify himself, there is one supremely real, which is the most imperative of all, namely that of his reader," and Rossetti was assiduous in trying out his work on his friends. Gerard Manley Hopkins wanted an audience, but failed to find the right inner circle for a sounding board. George Meredith, in the opposite group, aimed only at satisfying his own taste. And this may help to explain why his verse is unnecessarily obscure and failed to find many readers. William Morris suffered from being too keen on writing for his own sake. Morris sacrificed the arduous and irritating task of communication to the unmixed pleasure of putting words down. Swinburne, like Morris, was a fluent writer, but didn't even pause to let a second person read his poems before sending them straight to the printer. His favourite book of his own poems, Songs Before Sunrise, was also the only one Swinburne put through a crucible of revision, by showing it first to friends, including the Rossettis. Some poets do not fit the hypothesis, as Amos acknowledged. Christina Rossetti, for example, consulted nobody and solicited no advice, but her poetry is admitted to be none the worse for that. And then there is Tennyson. Nobody could accuse him of not seeking an audience, quite the contrary. But didn't his poetry suffer as a result? In his published essay, Amos issues Tennyson with a muted rebuke, tucked away in a footnote. The suggestion can also be made that concern to communicate with a very large audience is bad for a poet's work. The later career of Tennyson is the example here. In his unpublished thesis, Amos went further. It seems logical that a poet should write for his readers, but dangerous if he writes for readers who are also his intellectual inferiors. These pieces now seem to be just as revealing of Amos himself as of his Victorian poets. It is as if he had picked his way through their lives and works to find evidence that would support his view of how writers should behave. Signs of the literary values Amos was to pursue all his life can be seen peeping through the rather stiff prose and tentative scheme of ideas. In the essay, Amos precariously suggests that a poet who is concerned to communicate with an audience is more likely than one who is not to produce work which will survive the passing of its original readers. And the essay concludes that if this connection could be established, then perhaps the modern practitioners of the chapfallen romanticism may give up exhibiting themselves before their readers, and at last set about telling them something. Here is Amos taking an early crack at modernism and its obscurities. Other pieces in his Essays in Criticism point in the same literary direction. In one, published in 1952, Amis joined in a controversy started by The Observer over the breakdown of communication in modern literature. Ivor Browne blamed the writers, Philip Toynbee blamed the laziness of readers, but admitted cases of wilful obscurity, and gave Edith Sitwell's Emily-coloured hands as an example. What she actually wrote in her poem was Emily-coloured primulas. Amis set about dissecting the possible colours that might be associated with the name Emily, then the wide range of colours real primulas could be. But this makes him none the wiser, and he concludes that Sitwell isn't much interested in communication. Her readers were simply overhearing her personal fantasies, and so for her purpose any easily come-by freak is as good as the product of thought and imagination. In another piece he accuses the Ulster poet W.R. Rogers of a partial abandonment of the usages of articulate language. Amis examines Rogers' use of words like niggling and core, and concludes that they have no discernible sense connection with the context. He thinks Rogers' poetry is deficient in both meaning and sound, and finds that it has more affinities with some kind of word puzzle than with poetry. The attentive reader, who is incapable of surrendering his experience of the language, will react with irritated bafflement. The final effect, Amis declares, is the abandonment of all decent seriousness.